What if I told you that after our first video, new evidence has surfaced that might finally reveal who the lost German girl of 1945 really was? Forgotten documents, old photographs, and even possible witnesses have come forward. Today, we may get closer to the truth than any historian has ever been. Welcome back to another deep dive into one of World War II's most haunting mysteries. In our previous investigation, we explored the infamous footage of a badly beaten young woman filmed on May 8, 1945, near the Czech border. The video went viral, and something incredible happened. You, our viewers, sent us tips, theories, and leads that researchers have been chasing for nearly 2 decades. The lost German girl has been the subject of intense debate on forums like warrelics.eu since 2006. Some claim she was an SS operative. Others believed she was a Luftwaffe auxiliary named Laura Bauer. But despite years of investigation, her true identity remained shrouded in uncertainty, with no definitive proof to confirm any theory. Today, we're going to piece together everything we know. We'll examine new evidence that's come to light, analyze contradictions in the official records, and follow a trail that leads us through destroyed archives, hidden identities, and the chaos of post-war Europe. Some of these discoveries might completely change what we thought we knew about this case. The woman in that footage has haunted historians for decades. Her swollen hands clutching worthless Reichsmarks, her oversized military trousers, and that haunting expression captured by British journalist George Roger. But who was she really? Was she a Nazi perpetrator who got what she deserved? An innocent civilian caught in the wrong place? Or something far more complex? By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why this case represents not just one woman's story, but the fate of millions whose identities were erased in the aftermath of the war. And you might just help us find the final piece of this puzzle. If you're into this kind of historical investigation, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit that like button and drop your theory in the comments, because everything we've discovered so far came from you, our community of truth seekers. After our first video dropped, something extraordinary happened. Our inbox exploded with messages from viewers across Europe, some claiming to have information about the lost German girl that had never been made public before. One of the most significant developments came from a follower in Austria who contacted us about archived photographs from the Koleschlag region. According to their message, a local museum had recently digitized wartime records that included identification photos of young women who served as Luftwaffenhelferinnen, female auxiliaries in the German Air Force. Among these photos was an image of a woman bearing a striking resemblance to the figure in the 1945 footage. But here's where things get complicated. While the physical features appeared similar, the clothing and context were completely different. The archived photo showed a young woman in a crisp auxiliary uniform, taken in what appeared to be a formal military portrait setting. The woman in the roadside footage wore oversized military trousers that clearly didn't fit her properly. Was this the same person photographed years apart under drastically different circumstances? Other viewers sent us testimonies from elderly relatives who lived in the Sudetenland region during the war's final days. One particularly detailed account came from the grandson of a Czech partisan who was active near Pilsen in May 1945. According to his grandfather's diary, partisan groups had indeed encountered several German women trying to flee westward to avoid Soviet capture. The diary mentioned one specific incident involving a young woman who claimed to work for the Luftwaffe and was carrying identification papers. What makes this testimony compelling is the specificity of the details. The diarist noted that the woman had swollen hands, which matches what we see in the footage. He also wrote that she was released after being questioned, which could explain why she was filmed alone on that country road rather than in custody. However, not all the new information pointed in the same direction. A retired archivist from Prague contacted us with conflicting evidence. According to records from the immediate post-war period, several young women matching similar descriptions were processed through temporary detention centers in the region. But the documentation was incomplete, with many files destroyed during the chaotic transition period when Czechoslovakia expelled its German population. The archivist pointed out something crucial that previous researchers had overlooked. The shot card created by Captain Orrin W. Eglund, the American officer who likely facilitated the filming, labeled her as SS Girl and noted she was badly beaten up. But Haglund wasn't German-speaking, and in the confusion of the surrender, many Allied soldiers misidentified German military branches. A Luftwaffe auxiliary could easily have been mistaken for SS personnel, especially if she was wearing non-standard clothing. Then came perhaps the most intriguing lead of all. A viewer from South America sent us a scanned letter written in German, dated 1967, that referenced a woman named Laura who had worked for Pan Am Airlines. The letter writer mentioned that this Laura had a traumatic experience at the end of the war that she refused to discuss in detail. Could this be the same Laura Bauer that researchers have tentatively identified as the lost German girl? The problem is that none of these pieces of evidence provide definitive proof. We have circumstantial connections, plausible testimonies, and intriguing coincidences, but no smoking gun that definitively identifies the woman in the footage. It's like having pieces from 3 different puzzles that somehow seem to fit together, but we can't be certain they belong to the same picture. What became clear from all this new information is that we were dealing with something bigger than just one woman's identity. We were uncovering a systematic problem with how history recorded, or failed to record, the fates of countless individuals during the war's chaotic final days. And as we dug deeper into the evidence, one particular photograph kept coming up, a photograph that might change everything we thought we knew about this case. Among all the evidence that emerged after our first video, one particular photograph stands out as potentially the most significant piece of the puzzle. This wasn't a wartime military portrait or an identification card. It was a childhood photograph, and it raised questions that no one had considered before. The photograph surfaced from a private collection in Austria, specifically from the Kohleschlag region where Laura Bauer was reportedly born on February 3, 1921. The image showed a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, taken sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s. According to the family member who shared it, this was allegedly a photograph of Laura as a child, taken years before she would become involved with the League of German Girls from 1931 to 1938. What made this photograph so compelling wasn't any official documentation connecting it to the woman in the 1945 footage. Instead, it was the facial structure, the distinctive features that seemed to transcend the decades between the 2 images. The shape of the eyes, slightly deep set and wide apart, the particular angle of the jawline, the high forehead, and the way the hairline formed a subtle widow's peak. These weren't forensic conclusions, but they were striking enough to make researchers pause. If this truly was the same person, it meant we had a visual timeline spanning nearly 2 decades. A girl growing up in rural Austria during the economic devastation of the 1930s. A young woman who would have been 18 when Germany annexed Austria in 1938. Someone who would have been 24 years old when that terrible footage was captured in May 1945. But here's where the theory becomes complicated. Several viewers pointed out inconsistencies that couldn't be ignored. The childhood photograph showed a girl from a seemingly middle-class family, well-dressed and photographed in a professional studio setting. This didn't necessarily align with someone who would end up as a Luftwaffe auxiliary in Prague by late 1944. Middle-class Austrian families typically tried to keep their daughters away from military service assignments when possible, especially dangerous positions near the front lines. Others questioned whether we were looking at the right person entirely. What if this wasn't Laura Bauer at all, but another missing girl from the same region? The chaos of the Anschluss, when Nazi Germany absorbed Austria, displaced thousands of families. Children were separated from parents. Some were sent to live with relatives in different regions. Others were absorbed into Nazi youth organizations and lost contact with their original families altogether. One particularly unsettling theory emerged from this line of questioning. What if the woman in the 1945 footage wasn't using her real identity? In the final days of the Reich, people swapped identities constantly to escape prosecution or persecution. Someone connected to a high-ranking Nazi official might take the papers of a dead Luftwaffe auxiliary. An SS operative might claim to be a simple technical assistant to avoid harsh treatment by advancing Allied forces. The oversized military trousers she wore in the footage added another layer of mystery. Those clearly weren't her original clothes. Had she taken them from someone else, from a dead soldier, or had they been forced on her after her own clothing was destroyed or taken during the assault by Czech partisans? The pistol holster visible on her hip suggested military involvement, but whose holster was it? What troubled investigators most was the timeline. If the childhood photograph was authentic and showed Laura Bauer around 1930, and if she was indeed born in 1921, then she would have been exactly the right age in 1945. The math worked perfectly, too perfectly, some argued. It felt almost staged, as if someone had constructed a believable backstory using real dates and locations, but without concrete documentation to support the connection. Then there was the matter of her hands in the 1945 footage. Severely swollen, possibly fractured, suggesting she had fought back violently against her attackers. These were not the hands of someone who went quietly. Whatever happened on that road near Plzeň, she had resisted with everything she had. But whose hands were we really looking at? And did that childhood photograph show the girl who would grow into a fighter? Or were we connecting dots that didn't belong to the same picture? The photograph raised more questions than it answered. If this was really Laura Bauer as a child, then what happened in the years between this innocent portrait and that devastating footage? How does a middle-class Austrian girl end up beaten and alone on a Czechoslovakian road in the war's final hours? But if this wasn't Laura Bauer at all, then who was the child in the photograph? And more importantly, who was the woman captured on film in 1945? The answer might lie not in what we can see in these images, but in what was deliberately hidden from the historical record. As we dug deeper into the identity of the lost German girl, we kept running into the same frustrating problem. Documents that should have existed simply weren't there. Birth certificates, military service records, identification papers, all the bureaucratic traces that Nazi Germany was famous for meticulously maintaining, had vanished into thin air. The Nazi regime was obsessive about documentation. They kept detailed records of everything, from military assignments to racial classifications to youth organization memberships. If Laura Bauer really served as a Luftwaffenhelferin in Prague's anti-aircraft department in late 1944, there should be personnel files, assignment orders, payroll records, and performance evaluations. Yet researchers searching German military archives found virtually nothing connecting anyone by that name to that specific position at that specific time. The most obvious explanation is the sheer scale of destruction that consumed Central Europe in 1945. Prague itself suffered devastating losses during the final weeks of the war. On March 25, 1945, American bombers mistakenly struck Prague, killing around 700 people and destroying hundreds of buildings, including hospitals, churches, and administrative offices. The Prague National and University Library lost 25,000 books, and over 700,000 volumes from Charles University were stolen by German forces. When the Prague uprising erupted on May 5th, just 3 days before the footage of the lost German girl was captured, between 1,694 and 2,098 Czechs died, alongside up to 1,000 Germans in fierce street fighting. In this chaos, record-keeping collapsed completely. The National Museum was damaged in an apparent act of sabotage during the German capitulation, with working rooms, books, journals, and scientific records destroyed. German occupation archives covering Bohemia and Moravia from 1940 to March 1945, along with Gestapo and SS security service files, were hidden by retreating German forces and only partially recovered through secret operations like the American military's Operation Hidden Documents. But here's what troubles investigators. Some records survived. The Americans recovered massive caches of Nazi documents from hidden locations throughout Czechoslovakia and Germany. Millions of pages were preserved and eventually used in the Nuremberg trials and war crimes prosecutions. If random administrative paperwork survived, why would specific personnel files for Luftwaffe auxiliaries stationed in Prague be completely absent? One theory points to deliberate destruction. As the Reich collapsed, certain individuals had powerful reasons to erase evidence of their wartime activities. High-ranking officers destroyed documents linking them to war crimes. People connected to concentration camps or SS operations burned files that could send them to the gallows. But would a simple Luftwaffe auxiliary working in anti-aircraft defense need to destroy her records? What could possibly be so damaging about her service that every trace needed to disappear, unless she wasn't a simple auxiliary at all? The label SS Girl, written by Captain Hagland on the footage's shot card, keeps haunting this investigation. What if that identification wasn't a mistake? What if someone serving in a much more sensitive capacity had assumed the identity of Laura Bauer, a real person whose own records had already been lost or destroyed? In the chaos of May 1945, identity swapping was rampant. People took the papers of the dead, claimed to be someone else, fabricated entire life histories to escape prosecution or persecution. The Austrian connection adds another layer of complexity. Birth records from Kollerschlag, the small Austrian town where Laura Bauer was allegedly born in 1921, should exist in municipal or church archives. Austria maintained civil registration systems independent of German military records, yet researchers have struggled to find definitive documentation there as well. Was this simply the result of small-town record-keeping failures, or had someone gone to considerable effort to erase this woman's paper trail in multiple locations? Consider also what happened to the German population of Czechoslovakia after the war. Between 1945 and 1946, approximately 3 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia in a massive, often violent population transfer. In this upheaval, countless personal records were lost, destroyed, or deliberately disposed of. Someone trying to hide their identity could easily claim their documents were lost during the expulsion, the bombings, or the Prague uprising. No one could verify or disprove such claims because the documentary evidence had been consumed by the war's final conflagration. What makes this case particularly frustrating is that we can't determine whether these missing records represent mundane wartime destruction or something more calculated. Every person who might clarify the situation, every clerk who might have processed her papers, every commanding officer who might have known her real assignment, all of them are gone. The silence in the archives isn't just an absence of information. It's a void that could hide deliberate erasure just as easily as it could reflect simple chaos. The question we can't answer is this: if someone wanted to make Laura Bauer disappear from history, could they have done it? And more disturbingly, did they? Because if her identity was deliberately erased, it suggests something far more complicated than a beaten auxiliary on a roadside. It suggests someone with secrets worth hiding, connections worth severing, and a past that needed to be buried as thoroughly as the Nazi documents hidden in Czechoslovak mines and castle cellars. But whose secrets? And why would they still matter 80 years later? Among all the theories surrounding the lost German girl, one stands out as both the most controversial and the most compelling. The idea that she was not just another auxiliary or refugee, but the daughter of a German officer. This theory does not rely on a single dramatic revelation, but on patterns that repeat again and again in real wartime histories. Separated families, hidden identities, and desperate decisions made in the final days of the Reich. Throughout the war, countless families of German officers were moved, scattered, or evacuated as the front lines shifted. Fathers were sent to the Eastern Front to Italy to command posts in occupied territories, while wives and children were relocated for safety closer to administrative centers or military hubs. Many children grew up with a father who existed more in letters and uniforms than in daily life, and these families were especially vulnerable when the regime collapsed. If an officer had been involved in atrocities, belonged to the SS, or simply held a high rank, his wife and children suddenly carried a dangerous surname. This is where the officer's daughter theory gains strength. If the woman in the 1945 footage was the daughter of such a man, her real name might have been a liability rather than a protection. In the post-war chaos, being associated with a high-ranking officer could mean imprisonment, reprisals, or even execution without trial. For that reason, families sometimes took radical steps, changing names, destroying documents, or sending children away under assumed identities. A girl with the wrong surname might be safer posing as a low-level Luftwaffe helper than as the child of a notorious officer. The risks for these families in the immediate aftermath of the war were enormous. Civilians linked to the regime faced revenge from local populations, from partisans, and from occupying forces. In territories like Czechoslovakia and Poland, ethnic Germans were being rounded up, expelled, or subjected to brutal retribution. A young woman traveling alone could be seen as prey, as a bargaining chip, or as the embodiment of everything people wanted to punish. If she truly was an officer's daughter, anyone sheltering her could also become a target. That leads to one of the most disturbing questions in this entire mystery. Why was she alone on that road? There are several plausible explanations. She might have been separated from a fleeing column of refugees or soldiers in the chaos of an ambush. She might have been deliberately left behind by people who realized that being seen with her was too dangerous. If she carried papers or a face that connected her to a hated officer, abandoning her could have been, in their minds, an act of self-preservation. Cruel, but terribly human in a world collapsing around them. There is an even darker possibility. If someone was trying to erase her real identity, the safest way to do that might be to strip her of context entirely, remove family, remove uniforms that could be traced to a specific unit, leave her with only generic clothing and a vague story. A beaten, nameless girl on a rural road is almost impossible to place in a precise network of relationships and responsibilities. She becomes a symbol, not a person, a German girl, rather than the daughter of Captain X or Major Y. Seen through this lens, her swollen hands and bruised face take on a new dimension. They are not just the marks of random violence, but possibly the price of being both a target of revenge and a repository of dangerous knowledge. If she knew things about her father's unit, its actions or its escape routes, there would have been people who desperately wanted that information, and others who desperately wanted it silenced. Somewhere between those opposing forces, she ended up in front of a camera, caught in a few seconds of color film that outlived everyone who knew her real story. If this theory is even partially true, then the question shifts from who was she to something far more unsettling. If she really was the daughter of an officer, did someone somewhere make a conscious choice to sacrifice her identity in order to save their own life, or to protect a secret that still hasn't fully surfaced 8 decades later? What if the lost German girl didn't die in 1945? What if she survived, changed her name, and disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe? It sounds like wishful thinking, but the historical record is filled with cases of German children who did exactly that. Thousands of German children were separated from their families during the war's final months and adopted by families in other countries. The Wolf children of East Prussia fled to Lithuania, surviving hunger and cold by abandoning their German identities and taking Lithuanian names. Some were sent to Soviet orphanages, others found refuge with sympathetic families who hid their origins. Many never saw their parents again, and some spent decades believing they were truly citizens of their adopted countries. The Lebensborn program added another layer of complexity. Over 90,000 children were kidnapped from Poland, Yugoslavia and Norway by Nazi racial programs, given German names, and placed with German families. After the war ended, many of these children could not be returned to their original families because records had been destroyed or because they had been too young to remember their real identities. The reverse also happened. German children were taken in by families in formerly occupied territories, given new identities, and raised as natives. If the woman in the 1945 footage survived her ordeal, several escape routes were available. American and British occupation zones in Western Germany became destinations for thousands of refugees fleeing Soviet-controlled territories. From there, some made their way to South America, particularly Argentina and Brazil, which accepted large numbers of German immigrants in the late 1940s. Others went to Australia, Canada, or the United States under displaced persons programs. Changing your name was simple. You claimed your documents were lost in the bombings, provided a new identity to relief workers, and started over. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence supporting survival comes from a viewer message we received after the first video. A woman in her 70s, originally from Argentina, contacted us about her late mother. According to her account, her mother had arrived in Buenos Aires in 1947, claiming to be a Luftwaffe auxiliary named Laura. She rarely spoke about the war, but occasionally mentioned a traumatic incident involving Czech partisans near Prague. She worked for Pan American Airlines for 2 decades and died in 1994. The details align almost perfectly with what researchers believe about Laura Bauer. The timeline fits. Someone arriving in Argentina in 1947 could easily have spent 1945 and 1946 in displaced persons camps or working in occupied Germany before emigrating. The Pan Am employment matches records that suggest Laura Bauer worked for the airline from 1965 to 1985. Even the reluctance to discuss the war is consistent with survivors who carried trauma they couldn't process or feared revealing details that might expose their past. But as with everything in this case, we cannot confirm the connection. The viewer's mother is deceased, and no documents survive that would definitively link her to the woman in the footage. It's possible this was indeed Laura Bauer, living out her life half a world away from the road where she was beaten and filmed. It's also possible this was simply another German woman with a similar background and a coincidentally matching story. What makes the survival theory compelling is how common it was. Millions of people reinvented themselves after the war. They took new names, fabricated pasts, and built lives on foundations of deliberate forgetting. In that context, one young woman escaping her identity and starting over is not extraordinary. It's ordinary. It's exactly what countless others did to survive the aftermath of total war. But if she did survive, if she really did escape and build a new life, it raises one final haunting question. Did she ever tell anyone the truth about who she was and what happened on that country road in May 1945? Or did she take that secret to her grave, leaving us with nothing but a few seconds of footage and decades of unanswered questions? If there is one thing that keeps this mystery alive 8 decades later, it is this. People insist they knew a girl just like her. After our first video, comments and emails began pouring in from all over the world. Some spoke of a neighbor, others of a distant relative. A few mentioned a woman their grandparents used to talk about in hushed tones. None of these stories came with documents or photographs that could conclusively prove anything. But together, they formed a pattern that is very hard to ignore. Many of these testimonies share the same core elements. A German or Austrian woman who almost never spoke about the end of the war. Visible scars, either physical or emotional, that family members only understood years later. A strong reaction whenever Czechoslovakia, Prague, or the Russians were mentioned. In several accounts, the woman in question would leave the room or change the subject whenever newsreels or documentaries showed footage of refugees in 1945. These are not hard facts, but they are consistent with what is known about trauma and silence among survivors of wartime violence. What is striking is how similar these stories sound, even when they come from completely different countries and backgrounds. A woman in Canada who arrived from Germany in the early 1950s. Another in Brazil, whose family swore she had escaped the Soviets but never explained how. A grandmother in Austria who refused to travel east of the old border even decades after the Iron Curtain fell. Each testimony alone could be dismissed as coincidence, projection, or the human tendency to connect personal memories to famous images. But when you line them up side by side, the repetition becomes impossible to ignore. This repeating pattern suggests two things. First, that the woman in the footage could easily have been one of many with similar experiences, beaten, displaced, and forced into silence just to survive. Second, that if she did survive, she would have blended almost perfectly into this wider crowd of silent witnesses. She would not have needed an elaborate cover identity or a forged past. All she had to do was what millions of others did: refuse to talk about 1945, start a family, and let time bury the details. Ironically, this makes her survival more plausible, not less. The less she spoke, the safer she would have been. The more ordinary her post-war life appeared, the harder it would be to trace her back to that single, haunting moment on a Czechoslovak road. And if even a fraction of these witness stories are accurate, if just one of these grandmothers really was the girl from the film, then the truth of her fate may already have been told, quietly, at kitchen tables and deathbeds, in fragments that no one outside the family ever heard. Which leaves one final, unnerving thought. If so many people are convinced they knew someone like her, then how many other lost girls were never filmed at all? And what does that say about the one face that history did manage to capture, just for a few seconds, before she vanished back into the crowd? In the chaos that followed World War II, millions of identities simply vanished. Not metaphorically, but literally. People lost their papers in bombings, in forced evacuations, in refugee camps where documentation was burned to hide compromising pasts. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by the scale of displacement, issued travel documents based on nothing more than verbal testimony, later admitting they could not prevent war criminals from exploiting the chaos to escape undetected. An estimated 2 million displaced persons from Eastern Europe refused to return home after the war, creating a refugee crisis across Germany and Austria. 3 million ethnic Germans were forcibly expelled from Czechoslovakia, allowed to take only a single suitcase, their land and property confiscated. Hidden Jewish children who had survived by assuming Christian identities were found by surviving relatives or Jewish organizations, but many no longer remembered being Jewish and resisted going with strangers they didn't recognize as family. Entire generations had their identities shattered, rebuilt, or erased entirely. This is why the lost German girl is more than just one woman's story. She is a symbol of an erased generation, a face that represents countless others who disappeared into the blind spot of history. Her lack of definitive records, her missing documents, her ambiguous identity, these are not unique failures of documentation. They are the norm for millions who lived through 1945 and its aftermath. What do we actually know for certain? We know a young woman was filmed on May 8, 1945, near the Czech border. We know she had been severely beaten. We know she wore oversized military clothing and carried worthless currency. We know she was labeled SS Girl by an American officer, though that identification may have been mistaken. Beyond that, everything else is theory, conjecture, and pattern recognition. What do we still need to fit together? A definitive birth record connecting Laura Bauer to Kolleschlag, Luftwaffe personnel files from Prague in late 1944, testimony from someone who knew her before and after the war, a photograph that can be forensically matched to the footage, Any one of these pieces would transform this investigation from speculation into historical fact. But here's what makes this case so compelling. You might have that piece, somewhere in an attic, in a family photo album, in a letter written in fading ink. The final answer might already exist. It's waiting in a grandparent's diary that hasn't been translated, in a municipal archive that hasn't been digitized, in the memory of someone who heard a story decades ago and never connected it to the woman in the footage. This is why we're leaving these questions open. Who was she really? Did she survive? What happened to her in the years after that terrible day? If you have family from that region, from that time, if you've heard stories that match this pattern, if you've seen photographs or documents that might connect, reach out. Because history isn't written by professionals alone. It's completed by people like you, holding pieces of a puzzle you didn't know existed. And if we never find the final answer, then maybe that's the point. Maybe the lost German girl will remain what she has always been. A reminder that behind every statistic of war, every archive document, every historical footnote, there were real people whose stories were too complicated, too painful, or too dangerous to tell. And sometimes those stories stay silent forever, leaving us with nothing but questions, theories, and a few seconds of footage that refuse to let us look away. We may never know the true name of the lost German girl of 1945. After 80 years, the chances grow slimmer with each passing day. But here's what matters. Every clue we uncover, every photograph that surfaces, every testimony shared by viewers like you, brings us one step closer to understanding not just her story, but the stories of millions who were erased from history in those chaotic final months of the war. The truth is, this investigation isn't really about solving a mystery anymore. It's about remembering. It's about refusing to let one more face from 1945 disappear completely into the void of forgotten history. Whether she was Laura Bauer, an officer's daughter, a civilian caught in the wrong place, or someone whose real identity we haven't even considered yet, she was a person. She had a life before that road, and possibly a life after it. She deserves to be more than a few seconds of haunting footage labeled SS Girl by an American officer who may have been mistaken. The last piece of this puzzle might be closer than we think. It could be sitting in a comment section right now, written by someone who doesn't realize the significance of what their grandmother once told them. It might be in a municipal archive in Austria that hasn't been digitized yet, waiting for a researcher to request the right file. It could be in a family photo album in Argentina or Canada, where a woman who arrived in the late 1940s never spoke about her past, but left behind just enough clues for her descendants to connect the dots. This is where you come in. If your family came from Austria, Czechoslovakia, or Germany in the 1940s, look through those old boxes in the attic. If you've heard stories about a relative who refused to talk about the war's final days, ask the questions while there's still time. If you work in archives, museums, or historical societies, consider what might be hiding in collections that haven't been fully catalogued. The answer might already exist. It's just waiting for someone to recognize it. Maybe we'll never definitively identify her. Maybe the documentary evidence was destroyed, the witnesses are gone, and the truth died with them. But even if we can't give her back her name, we can give her something else. Recognition that she existed, that her story mattered, and that 80 years later, people still care enough to search for the truth. If this investigation resonates with you, if you believe history's forgotten faces deserve to be remembered, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Leave a comment with any information, theories, or family stories that might connect to this case. Share this video with anyone who might have a piece of the puzzle, because somewhere out there someone knows something, and together we might just find the answer that has eluded researchers for nearly 8 decades. The lost German girl is waiting. Let's bring her home.